So before we get going, one of the questions I get quite a bit through emails and people just asking is, this is the intermediate class. Did I have to take the intro class? And the answer to that is no. Everyone has a different comfort level with Excel based on past experience. However, if you would like to look at the previous lesson, I will send it in the follow-up email you will receive tomorrow, and you will receive, as Sheila had put in the chat box, all of the information about the slide deck, a copy of the recording, and some additional follow-up information. But you'll also receive the video link to the first class, which was Intro to MS Excel, that we did a couple weeks ago. So what does intermediate mean? Excel is something I have actively tried to learn something new with on a daily, if not, potentially weekly basis for about 20 years. It is an enormous program that has a lot of options, some which have, no real validity with what I do, but interesting nonetheless. So there's really no end to what you can learn in Excel. What we talk about with intermediate is when an employer says, Excel a must, or we want you to have Excel skills, what does that mean? And based on a lot of questions I've asked employers over the years, I'm basing it on 3 levels, intro, intermediate, and advanced. Now, advanced doesn't go to the end. It goes to what employers could reasonably expect someone to come into their office with as far as skills. So what we're going to cover today, based on what I define intermediate as, is we'll talk about cell formats, entering formulas, something called orders of operation, which is really connected to formulas. We'll talk about the different ways to reference cells, absolute, sheet, and workbook references. We'll do a little bit of filtering data and just a simple background on graphs and charts. And I'll give you some additional information to learn as much as you want about that. Now, the reason I consider this intermediate is basic Excel knowledge is about data entry. And you can go your entire career with that. That's fine. Many employers don't want or need you to create spreadsheets. This would allow you to create some spreadsheets, entering those formulas, formatting those values. So this is kind of some next level stuff that not everyone has, even if they say they're comfortable with Excel. So when we talk about formats, we talk about cells. Cells are the intersection of a column and row, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago, but I'll show you that on the screen here in just a moment. A cell can contain data, numeric, which would be numbers, or alphanumeric, which could be either letters or a combination of letters and numbers. It can contain a variety of formats, and we'll go over many of those today. It can also contain comments. I'll give an example of that in a little bit, but these are just little reminders to ourselves that give some definition or context to something someone has seen on a spreadsheet. And then we'll talk about formulas in depth, and what we're going to cover in a couple weeks in the advanced course would be functions. Functions can be part of formulas, but I like to separate them between formulas, which are unnamed calculations, and functions, which are things you would give a name to, rather than having a long-winded, a bunch of information and numbers and cell references. You just name it, and that would simplify it because it would do it all behind the scenes. And we'll talk about that, like I said, in the advanced class in about 2 weeks. So let's talk about formatting cells first. Here we have an Excel spreadsheet. This is the spreadsheet. The file itself is called a workbook, and you see that on the top here it says book 1. When we save that, we give it a name, but it's still considered a workbook. A workbook is comprised of several spreadsheets or worksheets, and on the bottom you'll see that it says sheet 1, and I could add additional sheets by clicking the plus. But first off, we're going to talk about how we would format a cell. And the first thing we need to do is select that cell. So right now I have cell A1 selected, and my cell indicator box is around that. And then I'm going to go up to the numbers grouping on the home tab of the ribbon, the numbers grouping right here. And I'm going to click on this little dialog box launcher. And by the way, this is something that you either know or you don't. All of these dialog box launchers, all 3 of these, in the font grouping, the alignment grouping, and the number grouping, bring you to the same dialog box. It brings you to the Format Cells dialog box. They just bring you to different tabs within that box. So in clicking on the number grouping, I am clicking on the numbers tab here. And once you do that, you have all sorts of options. And I can change the format of a cell to be currency, to be a date or a time, a percentage. There's some really crazy things you can do with custom formats. But I'm just going to demonstrate what some of the formats you could apply would be. So I'm going to bring over an Excel document. I just want to make sure, can everyone see this? All I need is one person saying yes. Are we seeing the Excel? Yes, thank you very much. And I'm going to put in a series of numbers. So I'm going to put in, let's say, 42.1 and 40.00. Notice I put 40.00 in there. As soon as I hit enter, it turns into 40 because that's the way this cell is formatted. It's formatted in the general number style. And then I'm going to type in 36.234. Okay. So I can tell what the format for a number is by selecting it and then looking up here. And in this grouping right here, you can see that it's in the general number format. Now, even though I typed in 40.00, all zeros to the right of the decimal place are just dropped off in that particular format. Well, if this were currency, I'd want to see those. I want to see them to 2 decimal places. So what I might want to do is just click on the drop down. This is just a quick way of getting to some of the formats. And I could say, let's put it in the accounting format. And you see the preview possibly of what that's going to look like. The accounting format is very popular within Excel. It does a couple of things. It puts a currency there. It puts it to 2 decimal places, but it also bumps it out a little bit from the side of the cell. I'm going to undo that. And notice that how close it is to the cell. If I redo it, that currency format bumps it out. That way, if there's any number right here, it doesn't tend to mash them up and look like one number. So it's a very, very popular format. Another option on this Format Cells dialog box is the Alignment tab. And this can be very handy for all sorts of reasons. You can put your text at a 45 for headings. There's all sorts of different things you can do here. But the one I want to talk about is the wrap text option. You don't have a lot of room. It doesn't look like you have a lot of room within a cell. So if I have some information here in this cell, and I enter information into an adjacent cell, what this is basically doing is stopping this information from going further than the border. So if I type in some just sample text, as soon as I hit enter, it disappears. It appears to. And I talked a little bit about this in the first class. If I click back up on that, all information is still there. Information is as entered, not as displayed. So the information is still there, but I can't see it. There's 2 options for that, and what I discussed last week is I could widen out the column to accommodate that. I could also double-click on the column between the 2 columns, or what I could do is I could wrap that text. Just like in Microsoft Word, when you wrap text, it gets to the end of your margin or your right indent, and then it goes down to the next line. Well, to do that, there's all sorts of different ways I can do that. I could just click on wrap text up here, but going back to that dialog box, I can choose alignment and wrap text. And now what it's going to do is it's going to increase the row height to accommodate that. Now, one thing to keep in mind with all formats, they only apply to the cell you apply them to. So even though this is a larger row height, if I type that same information into here, it's not going to wrap. Even though it could, it's not going to wrap because I don't have the wrap text format applied here. So in a case like that, you might want to select the entire row and apply the wrap text. And that way, you don't have to keep applying it over and over again. One other thing to mention about formats, and this is a very specific example. When I say numbers are as entered, not as displayed, that would be something like this. So if I have 1.33 and 1.33 and 1.33. I'm just going to do a quick calculation. Don't worry about how I do the calculation, but I'm just going to do a quick calculation on that. And we're going to find that, of course, you can probably do that in your head. This equals 3.99. If I apply a format to this, and I say I want that to be, well, let's just decrease the decimal. I'm going to decrease the decimal to no decimal places. I'll get a situation in which everything's rounded. They'll say 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4. And we know that's not true, but that happens occasionally. This is still 3.99. This is still 1.33. It'll work with those numbers, but it displays differently. I know that's kind of a weird concept, but to add one extra level of weirdness to it, that goes out the window when we're talking about percentages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on cell C1, and I'm just going to do a really quick and easy percentage format. The only way I know there's a percentage format there is because I clicked on it and it says percentage here. I applied that. Watch what happens when I type in 10 in this unformatted cell, and then I go to the percentage formatted cell and I type in 10 again. I typed in 10, but the actual number isn't 10. Can anyone tell me the actual number Excel is going to work with 10%? What is the actual number? You can put it in the chat box if you have a guess. All right, very good. 0.1. Yeah, 0.1, that's the decimal equivalent. And so if I format this cell to be a number again, not a percentage, but just a general number, it goes to 0.1. So that's the one exception. I entered it as 10, but the displayed is actually 0.1. That's to our benefit, but just make sure you understand that if you take a percentage format out, it's going to reinterpret that as the decimal equivalent. All right. So I did see a question in the chat box. What version of Excel is this? This is Excel 2013. I've worked with every version there has been since Excel's been out, basically. I currently work on one computer with 2000, another computer with 2007. This is my work computer, 2013. I have a 2019 version. You're really going to get whatever the most current version is if you buy it personally. And all of this stuff works basically the same. There's a few slight differences, but everything I'm going to teach you will be relevant to whatever version you're using. All right, so I'll take that off. All right, next we're going to talk about, here's just another example of what I just showed you. If I select this information here and I apply the accounting format, it's going to add those zeros in as I wanted or even as I had entered them. It doesn't really matter numerically or calculation-wise, but just for seeing them, it can be really handy to have that. All right, so another thing we can add to a cell is a comment. Now, comments are some things that are auto-generated, and then there are things we purposely put in there. If it's auto-generated, that means the computer's trying to tell you something, maybe a warning, or maybe about a circular reference, which is when you refer to the cell you're in within the cell you're in, or it might be something about, be careful because this is inconsistent data. If you see it with a red little tick at the top right of your screen, it's probably something you put in yourself. How you do that is you right-click on the cell you want to insert the comment in, and you choose Insert Comment. And then you just type it in. Now, the reason we would do this is maybe someone got a raise and someone's looking at the pay sheet and they want to say, well, gosh, that's not the same pay rate that I saw last time I did this. Well, a comment will answer that question so someone doesn't have to call. Once you've done that, you'll notice, again, there's that little red line there. I don't even have to click on that cell to see the comment. All I have to do is hover over it. You'll notice here the cell of reference is E5. The comment is in E4. If I just hover over this, it's going to show me that comment. And then if I put my pointer off it, it will disappear. If you want to delete a comment or edit a comment, again, all you'd have to do is right-click on that cell and choose that option. All right, we will stop occasionally. We're 15 minutes in. Sheila, are there any questions we need to get to?
The only other question that came up a couple times is they would like to know if you are going to cover pivot tables today and VLOOKUP and easy how-to steps for those.
Sure. The answer is no. That's the advanced class in 2 weeks. We will cover VLOOKUP, one of the one of my favorite functions. And I will do, much like I'm going to do with charts today, I'm going to show you how to do a pivot table, and then I'll give you additional information on how to implement that. Pivot tables and charts are very similar in that until you actually have to use them in a work situation or a specific situation. It's great to see them, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense and you won't remember it when you need it. So it's really important to have that backup instruction, and I will give you that, but I also will demonstrate it for you in 2 weeks.
And in reference to what version of Excel you were using, they'd like to know if you're using Windows or Mac.
Yeah, so I'm using a Windows computer. The reason I do that is it's a 93% chance I'm going to run into a business that uses Windows. I do realize there are some, really, really nice machines out there that run Excel off of a Mac. That's fine. I have seen more along the lines of Word. If you run Word off of a Mac, you're going to be very careful about how that will transition to a Windows computer. You save the Word document and you send it to someone who has a Windows computer. It doesn't always perfectly maintain format. I haven't had that problem with Excel from a Mac to a Windows, but honestly, I haven't had a lot of files sent to me from a Mac to a Windows environment. Good question.
Okay.
All right, let's talk. Go ahead.
They missed something on inserting the comment. So could you show again quickly how to insert the comment on
Sure.
there? And
yep. All you need to do is right-click on any cell that you want to insert a comment into. And what it's going to do is give you a contextual menu or a drop-down menu or right-click menu, whatever you want to call it. I call it a context menu. And then you click on Insert Comment. It'll always be there. Once you click on Insert Comment, it will give you the option to put information in. Now, by the way you get out of a comment once you've entered it is you click off. If you hit Enter, it's just going to get to the next line within that comment. You also have the option of making the comment box much bigger, and you can make it as big as you want, actually. I wouldn't do a whole lot of that, though, because what happens is once you've inserted that comment, you click off. Anytime you hover over a cell that has a comment in it, it's going to show the comment. If you have a huge comment box, it's going to be really hard to actually see the data that you're trying to look at. I hope that answered your question. Was there one more, Sheila, or should we go on?
Yeah, they're asking why did you use accounting instead of currency in the number heading?
Yeah, okay, let me just show you the difference. Oh, by the way, when you delete information, when I'm messing around with all these formats, when you delete information, I deleted that percentage out of here. Well, it's wherever I was when I did it. If I have a number that has a percentage into it, and let's just say I apply this percentage format, if I delete this number, I only deleted the number. When I click back up here, it's still the percentage format. They exist on another kind of level. Think of it as an overlay, just like comments. So if I truly want to get rid of all formats, I would select my entire spreadsheet and I would go to the editing grouping on the home tab, and I would click on clear, and then see I have all these different options. I can clear comments, contents, that's the actual data you enter. But in this case, I'm going to clear formats, and then they all disappear. So in looking at currency versus accounting, if I just do currency here, notice that the $ is right next to the number. If I do accounting, it just looks more like something you would see on a spreadsheet. Everything lines up better, and you do get that little bump out. Okay. All right, we'll move on. So formulas. And by the way, I am very aware that we could spend 6 hours on formulas. This is an introduction. Hopefully I can get your questions answered and give you some demonstration, but there's a lot to know about formulas. So formulas are calculations. They're entered into the cell where the result will appear. So you type them into the actual cell where you want the results to be. Once you hit enter, the result will show in the cell, but the formula is still there. So if you want to edit that formula, you could either go to the formula bar, or you could double click on the cell, or you could even hit F2 to edit that cell, and it will get you into that formula. And you'll see this as we kind of go along. Now, you could say a formula could be a cell reference. I don't consider it that. A cell reference could be equals A1. And wherever you type that in, it's going to give a copy of whatever's in cell A1 into the cell you type that. So if I type equals A1 into cell F5, whatever's in A1 will show up in F5. That's just a reference formula or a reference, cell reference. I don't consider that a formula. The formulas I work with have operators. And these are just things we've known since we've been in school. Plus, minus, division, and multiplication. I do want to point out, if you're familiar with the dot, hyphen dot that we all used in school, it's now the /, which is right underneath your question mark on your keyboard. And then Shift 8 is your asterisk, and that is your multiplication symbol going forward. You don't use the X anymore. In most cases, you want to use cell references when entering a formula. This is really important, and I'll give a demonstration in a minute, but if you don't use cell references, that formula is good for one time only. It's only good for the exact information you're currently working with. As soon as any of that information changes, your formula is going to be wrong. So you want to use cell references. I always thought that you only could put in 255 characters. I was even wrong there. It's 1,024 in earlier versions of Word as far as how long your formula can be. Currently, it's 8,192 characters. I will tell you, don't even come close to doing that. And the reason is, the longer your formula is, the more errors you're going to run into and the harder they're going to be to trace. When you do a complicated formula, you almost always have errors. So you always want to test it for a known result. The longer your formula is, the harder it is to trace where that went wrong. All right, so let's enter a formula. So I've got some information here, and I want to do a simple calculation. I want to say 4 plus 2 times 3. And you notice that I type that in, equal sign. All formulas and functions, by the way, start with an equal sign. So in the chat box, I want everyone to give me, or anyone who's comfortable, the answer to this formula. What is 4 plus 2 times 3? Okay, I see 18, 18. Someone said 10, 18 plus. Very good. Some of you have got it right. And by the way, don't feel bad if you don't. If you type this into a calculator just like this, you would get 18. But in Excel, and honestly, if you were to look at this formula on a piece of paper, it equals 10. And the reason is something called orders of operation. So what does that mean? In Excel, it doesn't determine what a formula means until you hit enter. Okay, so there's no running calculation being done. So what it does is it looks for exponents like pi r squared, a little 2 at the top, or parentheses, and it does those first. Parentheses means do this first. If it doesn't see any parentheses, then it starts at the left and goes all the way to the right and looks for multiplication and division signs and does those first. And then it goes back all the way to the back, treats that multiplication product as one number, and then it does addition and subtraction left to right. So I'll give you an example of that. What we just did was it took B4 plus B5 times B6. There's no parentheses, so the first order of operation was this multiplication symbol. So it took B5, which is 2, times B6, which is 3, which equals 6. And then it went back, and it said, what's 4 plus 6? And that's why we came up with 10. So if, yes, I see that, oh, is there a parenthesis needed? Yes, there is. Very good. If I put parentheses around the addition, it'll do that first. It treats it as one number, and I do come up with the answer of 18, which was what most people would have thought it would be if you hadn't heard this before. One of the things I do, even if it's not needed, just for clarity, if a calculation represents a number, like maybe the tax on something or whatever, I put it in parentheses. Now, sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's not, but it helps me when I'm looking at the formula up here on the formula bar, if it's long, to see, oh, in parentheses, that represents a number in and of itself. So sometimes it helps even when it's not needed. However, be careful understanding what they do. All right. Any questions on that before we move on?
They'd like you to go back and show the slide that shows the order.
There. You can look this up
Yes.
online, by the way, and there's more to it than this. In fact, there's a song kids learn in school now about orders of operation, and no, I will not subject you to my singing. But there's videos on it, and there's all sorts of information on it. When you're doing this calculations by hand on paper, it doesn't really matter, but it's very important in Excel because Excel only does what you tell it to, and it works off of these rules of order of operation and interprets what you're trying to do based on that. So it is important to understand it. And again, like everything on Excel, play around with it, try it before you need it so that you have an understanding of how it works before it has to work. All right, now next we're going to talk about using the fill handle. Now the fill handle is one of the greatest tools ever. It's not something that I think it was in Lotus 1-2-3 or VisiCalc, which were predecessors to Excel, but it really, really makes things easy if we use cell references. Let me show you something. I'm just going to go back to my example text here, and I'm going to delete everything. If I were to say 4 to 5, I had that here, and I just said equals 4 plus 2 plus 5, I would get the correct answer. Okay, that formula would work. The problem is, as soon as I change any of the data I used for that, it no longer works because the calculation was hard-coded to 4 plus 2 plus 5. That's why we use cell references. If instead I said this equals this number plus this number, and I'm clicking on them, it just makes it easier, plus this number, it doesn't matter what I change, this will always be the same. This will always not be the same. This will always change or adapt. So if I change this to 34, it recalculates for me. So it's really, really important that we use cell references in almost all cases instead of actual numbers in our formulas. This is incredibly important when we're using the fill handle. So you'll notice here, it's color-coded. I said this equals B4 plus B5 plus B6. When I hit enter, I get the result of that. I get the 10. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the fill handle. And you can play around with the fill handle a lot. There's a whole bunch you can do with it. But what it does is it copies or continues progressions or series. So if I put my pointer right on this bottom right little square, that's the fill handle. My pointer in a live situation would turn into a black cross. And I can click and drag that across. And what happens is it adapts as I go. All the cell references adapt, and that's what the fill handle does. It changes in the direction that you drag it. So when I went from here to here, how many rows, how many columns did I change? How did I change? How many columns did I, easy for me to say. How many rows did I change when I went from this cell to this cell? You can put it in the chat box. Someone says 3, 3, 4, 3, 1. Okay, it's a trick question. 0. Ah, there we go. Someone got it in just before I said it. Okay, because I said rows. When I went from this cell to this cell, I'm in row 7 the whole time. So the cells referenced wouldn't change based on the row, and nor do I want them to. But when I went from this cell right here to this cell right here, I did change 1, 2, 3 columns. So if you look, if you zoom in, what was B4 plus B5 plus B6, when I drug it over here, it became E4 plus E5 plus E6. And similarly, this was D4 plus D5 plus D6. So I typed the formula in once, and because it was with cell references, I can drag that formula to be relevant to each of those columns. Okay? It does take a little kind of mulling and figuring out what's actually happening there. The easy answer is it does what we want it to do. I challenge you to try to come to some sort of understanding on what it's technically doing, because there are times when that would help. However, there are times when we don't want it to change. We want to be able to drag a formula, that certain parts or certain cell references need to be constant, okay? And that's something called an absolute reference. This is where we lock in a particular cell, so no matter where we bring it, it doesn't change. So when we just type in a cell like A1, nothing is absolute. If we drag that cell reference someplace else, it will change in the direction we change it. If we go over a column, it'll change a column in the cell. If we go down a row, it'll change a row in the cell. However, there are times when we want to lock in one or the other. Now, be very careful with this. This is the most commonly misused reference as far as absolute references go. People put this $, which just denotes absolute, in front of a cell and think it's going to lock in the entire cell. It doesn't. It just locks in this case, the column, because the $, locks in whatever it's in front of. In this case, this is going to change, the A, but the row 1 won't change no matter where I drag it. This would be for like a sliding fee scale. There's very specific examples. I don't have one ready to go here, but you could certainly look at a video online of this. In most cases, especially when you're starting out, the one you want to use is this. Even if you could use one of these, think of it as if a number sits by itself and doesn't change, use this. It'll save you headaches. You lock in both the row and the column. Nothing will change no matter where you drag it. And I'll give you an example here in just a minute. One of the handy tools I found out way too late in my Excel learning curve was if you're typing in a cell into a formula, the function key F4, that's on the top of your keyboard, will actually cycle through different absolute references. So it'll cycle through all 4 of these references. And it starts, the first time you hit it, will do an absolute on both, which is really handy. But you can certainly type them in. So I'm going to give an example, and then I'll pause for any questions you might have. So in this case, okay, there's a lot of different ways to do what I'm about to do, so I'm sure other people have different ways of doing it, and I'm not even really concerned if you understand the math part of it, but what I do want you to understand is what's happening with the absolute reference. What I'm doing here is I want to calculate what the total amount would be for these 3 items with the 7% tax added. So in this case, I am saying I want it to equal B7, which is the total, and then I'm going to times that by basically 107%. That's why I say 1. 1 plus the percentage gives me 100% of the cost plus 7% of the cost. And that's just an easy way of applying a tax rate. There are other ways of doing it. Once I do that and drag it forward, I'm going to get the tax for each one. Now going back here, you can see that there is a $sign in front of both the B and the 1. So this sits by itself. Wherever I drag that, it will stay B1. Wherever I drag this, will change in the direction I drag it. So let's zoom in on the formula bar for this particular cell. And you can see that even though I drug it from here to here, B1 stayed B1 because of the absolute reference. What was B7 turned to E7 because I went over 1, 2, 3 columns. Now, in most cases, when you drag cells, it will appear that it's just going to whatever column you happen to be in. It's not really. It's counting the number of columns. So if you, like, say, reference something here in this cell and drug it over, it would be offset. Play around with it, try it a bunch of different ways, and you'll eventually kind of get a feel for it. But again, the fallback is it does what we want it to do. I'm going to pause just for a second to make sure there aren't any questions on that. Sheila, is there anything we need to get to?
The only thing I see is on the previous slide, someone asked if it would be the same way going down. I'm not sure what that was in reference to.
Yeah, yep. If I drug this down, that's why I locked in them both. I didn't even technically have to lock in the row. I didn't, because I went from here to here. I didn't change any rows. But like I said, this isn't going to change. It's not a sliding fee scale, so I lock them both in. So if I drug this straight down, that B1 is going to stay B1. It doesn't matter where I drag it. I could drag it, you know, to the end of this spreadsheet, and it would stay B1. Absolute references are something that, for whatever reason, it's kind of a hard thing to grasp, but once you have it, boy, it saves you a lot of time. The other thing I will mention, once people start working with absolute references, they tend to overuse them. You don't need them if you want the information to change. So if I were to put in an absolute reference here on E7, it would say 10.7, 10.7, 10.7, 10.7, because nothing would change as I drag it. And so this is a combination of we want this to change and we don't want this to change. So always make that determination. And the easiest way to think of that is, does this number stand alone? Does it change based on where I drag something? If it doesn't, make an absolute reference.
Can you show again how you lock the row? How do you lock in the row?
$sign. Yeah, by putting a $sign. Let me just bring up a live example here. So let's say that I had, I wanted to add $2 to this information. Okay, so I'm going to add this $2, and it might change over time. So I'm going to keep this as a cell reference because maybe it'll go up by $3 or $4. So I'm going to say equals this cell. Now I'm going to put an operator in, which is just the addition operator. Then I'm going to click on this cell. But remember, one of the handy ways of locking in, I could either put the $sign in front of the row and the column, or the column and the row, or I could hit F4. And just hitting the F4 key, notice what happens there. It cycles through all the different versions from no absolute, completely absolute, row absolute, and column absolute. Okay, so this locks in the column, this locks in nothing, this locks them both in, and that only locks in the row. So if I put them as completely locked in, now I can grab that fill handle. Oops. By the way, when you are getting out of a cell, don't click out of the cell, hit enter. Sometimes it'll work, but in many cases what happens when you click somewhere else, what it does is it inserts that cell into the formula. And in this case, it's not what I want. So I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to go back up, use my fill handle, and drag straight down. And you see it works just the same as if I had done it along a row. That cell reference gets locked in. So the D2 or D, whatever it was, changed as I went. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about, all that worked just dandy within the same worksheet. And you can go a long way in your career without ever having to go beyond that. But at some point, you're going to use multiple sheets. When you use multiple sheets in a workbook, you may want to reference certain information in sheet 2 that happens to be in sheet 1. There's a couple of different ways to do this, but there's also an additional method of referencing information in a completely different workbook. And there's some things to consider when you do that, but it can be done. This is really handy, and honestly, it's very easy once you understand the quick way of doing it. It's really hard to remember the syntax, and that's a term I may use again here. Syntax is just the way you type things in, the correct way of entering information, or in this case, references. This correct syntax for creating a off-sheet reference is equals the name of the sheet, and by the way, whatever that sheet's named, it could be named Monday, that's fine, exclamation point, and then the cell you want to reference. The reason we have to do that is, if I look here, A1 is in sheet, or in this case, source. I have this sheet named source. And then if I go to destination, the sheet destination, there's another A1. What's to differentiate A1 in one versus A1 in the other? And that's what this is about. So to do this, you don't have to type it in. I could look at this and say, okay, that's in source. So I'm going to go here and I'll say equals source exclamation point A1. And if I remembered everything correctly, you'll see that even though I typed in this formula, it looked at the sheet called source, looked at cell A1, and what happened to be there was the number 2. So if I change this to a 9 and go to that sheet in which it was referenced, it's changed to a 9 too, and that's very handy. I have found that when I really need this, which isn't very often, I forget the syntax. So here's a cheat, I guess, a cheat code, to use gamer terminology. Let me see if I can get this to, trying to get this to give me access to the top. Okay. Give me a second here. Okay, so the easy way to practice this is to open up 2 occurrences of the same book. So basically you're opening the file kind of like twice. You could certainly do this different ways. The easiest way is to go to View on your ribbon and you click on New Window. And what that's going to do is give you basically just another instance of your document. So I'm going to split these out. So I have the same, tab open in both. These are the same file, same exact workbook. So if I type in 67 here, notice it shows up over here. Where this becomes handy is when I look at different sheets on the same workbook. So on this side, on the right-hand side, I have the source tab open. On the left-hand side, I have destination. So let's go ahead and I'll enter in something here and I say, I love Excel. Okay, that's just text. It'll just be a text reference. That's alphanumeric data. So if I want to reference this in this other sheet tab, here's a really nice trick. All I do is I go to that sheet tab, I type in equals, and then I go over to the other sheet in that same workbook basically, and I click on it. You have to click twice, once to make it the active window and once to select it. And you'll notice what that did, immediately it put in the correct syntax. It put in equals source, exclamation, B7, because that's where I clicked. Once I hit enter, what is here is now referenced here. So if I change this to I don't, or IDPM, or whatever it happens to be, you notice it changes over there. Okay. Before we get to questions, I want to show you one more example, and this is that next level. This is within a workbook. You can also do this, and by the way, you can close out of any additional instances of a workbook without having to save. It's not going to ask you if you want to save the changes because there's still one instance open. I'm going to open up a completely different workbook. So this is a file called Suspense. Okay, so in this case, again, I have them both open and I can split the screens. I could have them on different monitors. I could even do it through, other means. But what I'm going to say here is, I'm just going to say equals. And then I'm going to go to this additional program or this additional document. And I'm going to say this cell. And notice what it did there. That's a lot to remember. That's a lot to remember how to do this syntax. It's equals, bracket, the name of the file, bracket, the name of the sheet, exclamation point, the name of the, in this case, it put an absolute reference in there for me. I could change that, the name of the cell. So when I hit enter, it changed there. And if I change it here, it changes there. Okay. Now, I'm going to caution you. If you do this, be very careful. I would never assume everything's going to work perfectly if I move that file. It may not. I would never depend on it. So when you do this, it's looking for that file in a certain folder path or a file path. And if you move that, especially if you move it off your computer, there's no way it's going to be able to find that information. So have a good folder structure set up. And if you need to do this, just be careful about moving any of those files. All right, that was quite a bit of information. Are there any questions, Sheila?
Oh, you've created a lot of questions.
Okay. I hope interest questions.
Can you use syntax from book 1 and book 2 or other workbooks?
Okay, syntax is just the way you type things in, but yes, you can use them across anything. You could use them on different sheets and different workbooks within different sheets in the same workbook. So yes, it's very malleable as long as you maintain the same folder path if you're working with two documents. I'm not saying it won't work if you move them around. I'm just saying don't count on it working if you move them around.
Can you show again how you brought up the two screens
Sure.
of the same sheet?
Yeah.
And when you bring up the two separate views of that same sheet, you're not opening the same document twice?
No, I'm not. I could do that. That would be one way of potentially doing it, but that would be a harder way. What you're doing here is, if I'm on the Home tab, what I can do is I can go to the View tab on the ribbon, and I can click on New Window. And all this does is it basically opens another instance of the same workbook, okay? So then, excuse me, then I just split them. And this has nothing to do with Excel, but it's a very handy little trick. If I want to perfectly split two files on either side of a monitor, I just hold the Windows key down and press the right arrow key on the first one. I click on the second one. I hold the Windows key down, which is second from the bottom left of your keyboard, and I hit the right arrow key, and then I'll get a perfect split. There's other ways of doing that, but I just makes it really handy. That way I'm not resizing and moving things around. So in this case, and by the way, this is the only way I do it anymore. If I want to make a reference to something, all I have to do is, in this case, I'm going to put it over here. If I want to make a reference to this cell in this different tab, all I have to do is hit equal sign, and that tells the computer, hey, we're looking for something. So that if you didn't do the equal sign, this wouldn't work. And then I go to that other cell in the other spreadsheet. Remember, I'm in destination here. I'm in source here. So I have to click on it once to make it the active window, and that's just a Windows thing. You can only have one active window at a time. And then I click on it again, and what it does is it inserts that cell reference here into that cell that I had hit equal to. Once I hit enter, the result of that formula or reference, whatever you would like to call it, shows. You're still going to see the formula up here, the reference formula. It's still going to say what it is, and if I double click, I'll see it. But that is so much handier than trying to remember the syntax, the way you would type that in correctly, especially when you get to working with off workbook references. That's a lot to remember, okay? All right, we can take one more question before we move on.
Okay, here's a quick one. If you change the first sheet name, will you lose reference on the second sheet?
No, you won't. And I'm fairly confident in this. Let's try it, shall we? So in this example here, I have this called source. I'm referencing source C2, so I'm referencing right here. Now, if I go down here and I change source to be something, you'll notice that if I do it correctly here, I'll go to destination. It changed it for me. Now, I never would have depended on this until I tried it like 8 times to make sure it worked, but it will do certain things the way you want them to. It will do some things that really surprise you, but when in doubt, don't trust it. Make sure it works before like your job it depends on it, I've seen situations where someone's doing a presentation with Excel, they do some last-minute edit, and all of a sudden nothing works. All the calculations go bad. Don't do that to yourself. Make sure you trust the syntax or the process before it's required to work for you. That was a quick question. All right, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end also. I just want to make sure I get through all of the information that I have together for you. So let me go ahead and minimize some of this stuff. The next thing we're going to talk about is how Excel sees dates. And this can be very important when you're invoicing customers or you're working with dates. It's a format, and you notice that I'm in cell C3, and it's recognized as the date format. There are a lot of different variations of the date format. You could have month, year, month, date, short year. There's a lot of different things you can go through on the numbers dialog box launcher to see the different formats. But let's just go with the standard here. you're off mute there, Sheila. If I choose, by the way, I have that cell. Let me go back. I have this cell indicator box on the cell I want to apply this format to. That's very important. And then I go up here to just a quick format change. I don't have to go to the dialog box launcher because it's right within the grouping. And I click that drop down. And I change it from the date, which it already is, in this case, the short date format, and I choose general number. It turns today's date into, very strangely, 44,098. Okay? And that may seem really strange. Why would that happen? Well, I'll demonstrate why it will happen by this date. This is a very special date in the Excel world, January 1st, 1900. If I do the same thing I just did to today's date, and I click up here, and I click on general number, it turns into the number 1. That's where the counting starts. January 1st, 1900 is number 1. Today's date, it's been 44,098 days since January 1st, 1900. Which, okay, that's all interesting. What good does it do us? What it allows Excel to do is do a linear count of dates through, 30 days has September, April, June, and November, the 31s, the leap years, the 28 days, the 29 days. It can keep perfect track of that. So if I want to find the difference between any two dates, I can just subtract them. Let me do a quick example of that. If I did this and I said, okay, this equals 9, 24, 20, and I say, oops, see, I think I had a percentage format in there or something. I had something going on. So I'm going to say 9. Oh, I put an equal sign. That's why. So I've got this date here. And now I'm going to say, okay, I'll put someone in my life's birthday. Okay. And I want to see how many days it's been since this person's birthday. This will be the higher number because it's the more current date. All I have to do is say equals this cell minus this cell. Because remember, Excel sees them as numbers. It used to, and this was very strange, give you a date. It'd give you a date like February 2nd, 1900. Now it's smart enough to know when you subtract a date from a date, you really want the days in between, and it will give you that there's been 92 days in between those two dates. So this would be very good if you wanted to say take today's date, take the payment due date off an invoice, subtract them. If it's over 30 days, maybe you apply a surcharge or whatever. Dates work really, really well in Excel once you understand that they're based on just numbers. All right, before we move on with that, any questions that we need to get to, Sheila?
Well, talking about dates, someone asked, what about Julian dates?
Julian calendar. Wow. You can format the dates any number of ways. There's all sorts of different formats for dates, and if you wanted to get crazy, there's special formats and custom formats in which you can do, I would imagine, anything you want to. If you wanted to go off the Julian calendar or whatever. That is a little above and beyond what we're going to talk about today, and off the top of my head, I couldn't do it, but this is, I think, where you would go. By the way, I've actually done a couple of these. It's amazing what you can do with custom formats, and you can change a date to something completely different very easily once you understand the custom code. All right. So next, we're going to talk about filtering data. I filter data every single day in order to send out the invites for you today. I filter data. What I did is I got the entire attendance list, and then I filtered it by email address, and then I filtered it by time, and I took summary data off that. There's all sorts of things you can do with data, but you can't do anything with it unless you are consistently entering information. So what filtering does is it looks for duplicates in many cases. It can also just alphabetize and things like that. But if I spelled my name Art, and then in another instance spelled it Arthur, they wouldn't connect because they're not consistent. So when you're entering data into Excel, and especially into a database like Access, be very careful about consistency of data. A lot of times when people put Minnesota into something, we make them choose from a list. You ever wonder why you have to click the drop down and then choose capital M, capital N? If you don't do that, if you don't choose from a custom list, what happens is you'll get Minnesota, M-I-N-N period, M-I-N-N, M, capital M, small n period, capital M, small n, and then capital M, capital N. All of those are different values, and you will not be able to group those values. So that's why, and by the way, in Excel you can do this too. You can create a custom validation chart and choose from a list. We'll touch on that in 2 weeks. It's really, really handy for consistency of data. When you're filtering data, you want to have heading rows. So these would be like first name, last name, city, state, zip, like for a phone directory. You can do multiple levels of filters based on primary, secondary, and tertiary, or whatever you want to consider the third sort or whatever, but they're all dependent on the previous. So what happens is, if I had a phone book and I wanted to find a John Smith that lived in Aurora, Minnesota, primary sort would be last name, Smith. Secondary sort would be John, first name. Tertiary sort would be city, Aurora. And I'll kind of show you how that works. Once you have that information, what you can do is you can copy it and then put it into a Word document, put it in a report, save it as a PDF, whatever you want to do. Let's just jump into it actually. It's found on the Data tab. So in this case right here, I have a whole bunch of information. In fact, I have 966 entries into this. I'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay. And so I have this heading row. And so I'm going to click on the heading row, and I'm going to go to the Data tab, and I'm going to click on Filter. Sometimes you have to insert a data row, or excuse me, a heading row for this to make sense. And that's just going to insert, and if I can find it here. No, going to Home and Insert Row to put a heading row above your data. Sometimes you have to do that. But in this case, I already have it pre-formatted. And so what I'm going to say is, based on these heading row, I want to filter. So I just go to Data and Filter. I did this quickly a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to explain it a little bit more thoroughly here. Now I have that one click, 2 clicks. I have a lot of powerful tools here. So if I want to do a primary sort, what I could do is I could click on this filter, and you see that these all have little drop downs. So the first one I click on is going to be my primary sort. Now I could just say alphabetize, and it would alphabetize for me, and sometimes that's all I need. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to deselect everything so it doesn't show me everything, and I only want it to show me one person. So in this case, I want to show me all the examples of Agnes Moorehead. Okay, I'll click OK, and you'll see that there are a whole bunch of examples of when she appears in this database. And you'll see that they happen in non-contiguous rows. So these are filtered rows. The next thing I can do is say, what's the secondary sort? Now, not all of these columns have to be sorts. Some of this is absolutely unique in data, and it doesn't make sense to sort by it. But I'm going to at least do a secondary sort. So what this is going to do is show me, based on this information, what goes along with that information. So again, I'm going to deselect everything, and I'm going to go to let's see, this particular show. And I can see that this actress performed this show on these dates. Now, of course, this is very specific to a hobby. This could be done very easily for all sorts of data. It could be used for voter rolls, for canvassing, for whatever. It could be used for what I used it for today, which was to find out who was the most recent registrant, so that I could just send information to that person without sending it to all 250 people who registered. There's a lot you can do with this. It's very, very handy. The one thing I would add to this, and I did show this last week, you might also want to freeze the top row of any big list you're filtering. And the reason for that is, as soon as you scroll, you notice you lose that top row. So all you're going to do there is you're going to click on the top row, and you're going to go to View and Freeze Panes. And again, this recording of this will be available, but also there is a specific lesson on freezing panes and filtering within the GCF material that I'll send out to everybody. So once I freeze that top row, notice that no matter where I scroll, I still get that top. All right. Now I did have some PowerPoint slides to demonstrate this also, because I'm going to be sending you the PowerPoint, but we don't need to go through what I just did in the slides. So before we move on, we'll stop for just a couple of questions. If there are.
A few people have asked, what's the best way to show on your resume that you're taking these classes and you have intermediate Excel skills?
Okay. Notice when I define intermediate skills, I said my definition. If I didn't say that, I should have. One of the mistakes I think people make when they define a skill set on a program, a proficiency with a program, is they will say something like proficient or intermediate skills or advanced skills. I've had someone put advanced skills on a resume for Excel that didn't even know the basics. But for them, they knew more than they had ever known before by taking a course, so they consider themselves to be advanced. That's very arbitrary, and it's based on any one person's definition of that term. So I would much rather someone say what you can do with Excel on your resume. Ability to create formulas and functions to report on financial data within Excel. If I said that, that tells an employer what I can do. If it's data entry, how many keystrokes per hour can you do within Excel? By the way, that's different than words per hour. Words per hour are the number of keystrokes divided by 5, and that's per minute, basically divided by 60. Keystrokes per hour, because there's no average number, average word is 5 letters, there's no average number, so you denote data entry skills in keystrokes per hour, and that's like 13,000 would be a good metric for that. That would tell an employer what you can do with the program. But if you've taken some courses, if you go onto Coursera, we'll give you the information on the Coursera learning platform, and I'll give you some samples of some of the Excel courses that are available there. There's like 10 or 20 that you can take. If you get a certificate for that, list that. Say, I completed the Duke University Advanced Excel course. If you've got a certificate for it, put it there. That says you have it. And one of the things I did, because I teach it, is, it was great that I was able to learn this stuff, but no one wants a self-taught teacher in most cases. So I took a Microsoft Office Specialist certification, and that will basically tell an employer I at least have that level of skills. So it's a certificate, but that costs money. The Coursera does not cost anything if you register by the end of this year, and I'll give you more information of that in the follow-up email.
Want to take another question?
Yeah, we can take one more.
How do you avoid cross-data errors when filtering and sorting?
You shouldn't, if it's done correctly, you shouldn't run into that. If it's entered correctly, you really can't mess it up. At least I haven't been able to, and boy, I can mess things up pretty easily because the computer's doing it. Every sort you do is dependent on the previous sort. So you're never cross-filtering because you're always working with a new set of data. That's why there's primary, secondary, and tertiary sorts. If I were to say, apply a sort to this and this at the same time, I don't even think there's a way to do that. And then you would run into issue of some contamination across. I've never personally run into a situation like that. All right, we're going to just briefly go over charts. And I do want to preface this by saying we could go all day on charts. Charts are fun. I rarely have to use them. Every time I get into charts, it's a new learning experience for me. It happens pretty quick because I've learned it before. And that's what you're going to find out in any computer program. If you don't use it, you lose it. I don't find a personal reason to use charts very much, so I do lose that knowledge in between usages. It just comes back to me much quicker each and every time I have to relearn it. And part of that is I have the resources to find out exactly how to do it. YouTube, if nothing else, will tell you exactly how. There's millions of videos on how to do charts, but I'll give you an example here. So first off, with creating charts, you need to select the information. Like everything in Excel, you need to select the information that you want to illustrate. So if you just, have some information and try to create a chart, it'll say, what do you want to create a chart on? So you have to select that information. You need to, you locate it on the illustration grouping of the Insert tab, and then you want to choose the best match for the type of data you want to display. There are some really, really cool looking charts and graphs that are impossible to read based on the data you're putting. There's something that looks like a spider web. They call it a radar chart. There's scatter shot charts. And you have to really test it out with an audience and say, can you understand what I'm trying to convey here? Because if they can't, the whole idea is to give a visual, easy to understand representation of data. And if that doesn't accomplish that, you're wasting your time with your audience. So try a bunch of different options, play around with them as much as you want. I do give a link for additional instructions on the GCF Global. There's a whole section on charts, but I'll show you the simple way of doing it. So first off, you get some data, and you want to format it like a table. I mean, think of it, it's got to have kind of like an XY axis. So in this case, I have months across the top. I have weeks across the bottom, and then I've got information. And all I need to do is select that information. And then in this case, I'm going to go to recommended charts. Notice I'm on the Insert tab, and there's this whole section on charts. So I'm going to go to recommended charts. And I hate to say it, but the bar charts are the easiest to understand, and they just are. I know there's a lot of cooler things we could work with, but it's being able to reach your audience immediately. If you can't do that, it's a wasted effort. You choose the chart you want, and then it creates a chart. Now that chart may just, plop where you don't want it. It's now basically an object. Sheila, I just want to make sure, are you still hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Sometimes when I get a call coming in, it's for someone to say, we lost you 5 minutes ago. So I'm glad I didn't lose you. So in this case, this becomes like a floating object. I can move it anywhere I want. I can resize it. I can adjust it. I'm going to do that in a live demonstration just to show you kind of how you could work with this. So I'm going to go to the other sheets. Okay, so I had a sheet, and by the way, this is a great example of why we specifically name worksheets. If I had to hunt through for this, sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, I wouldn't have known what to do, but I named this sheet chart. So I just clicked on it, and now I have that data to work with. So in a live situation, I can select this. I go to I don't remember what I said there. Oh, this is under Insert. And then I go to the recommended charts. I choose that chart, and I click OK. Now notice it plops right there. I can use the editing or the resizing to make it as small as I want. I can bring it up. I could take this information. I could right-click on it. I could copy it. And one of the cool things you can do is you can go to a Word document and you can paste it. And I still have some of the tools to change it. And the reason this works is because Word and Excel are in the same Office suite and works very well. However, if I didn't need the ability to maybe adjust the type of chart or in any way filter it, there's all sorts of things you can do. I could just take a picture of that. I could use the snipping tool. I could do a screenshot. I could do whatever, and then I could put it into any document. I could put it in an email. I could save it as a PDF. I could save it as a PDF from here. Charts work really well in reports. Most of the reports you see, they're not going to give you all of the documentation. They're going to give you, hopefully, some simple to read charts in which the speaker or then they can give some narrative piece to describe what happened. I don't want to shortchange you on charts. It's just that there are limitless possibilities within this. There's so much you can do. Another thing to keep in mind, you get 2 additional contextual tabs. By that I mean on your ribbon, there are 2 tabs, Design and Format, that deal specifically with all sorts of things you can do with charts. So I can click on the Format tab, and these are specific to charts. I can do the Design tab, and this is going to work with all the different types of charts I could work with. There's basically, you could spend half your career looking at different charts. I will save you that time and say bar charts work the best in most cases. All right, I did leave a good 20 minutes for questions, but I do want to wrap up with just a couple of resources. For those of you who have been to any of the previous sessions, this is a bit of a repeat, but if you want extended information and you want videos to watch and you want files to download and try some of this stuff, and that's the way you're going to learn best, by the way, working with real files and trying to do some of this stuff, just go to Google and type in GCF Excel in whatever version you have, click on the first link, and by the way, these will be in the notes, and then you're going to get information specific to what we talked about today. So we talked about formulas, about creating some more complex formulas with some different references. We talked about relative and absolute cell references. You're going to get an entire lesson, an entire hour of information at least on all 3 of those. And once you've done that, once you have completed all of the exercises and the quizzes, then I do recommend you jump over to North Star Digital Literacy and do a test. Just see where you're at. This particular one is actually a screenshot from the word test, but it works the same. If you go to this link, you'll be able to take an Excel test. It's not going to, go way out there in super advanced stuff, but it will give you a real good litmus test to tell an employer, or even list it on your resume. That was one of the questions. If you say pass the North Star Digital Literacy certificate on Excel 2016, that's better than saying I'm good at Excel. Okay. That's one option at least, and it's a free option. All right, we'll spend the last 15 minutes with as many questions as we can get to.
That means I need to unmute myself. Well, here's a couple easy ones. Are you going to be doing a course on PowerPoint or one on Access?
So the PowerPoint's a possibility. Just seeing how this is going. It's going well. We're getting a lot of people registering for these and attending, and certainly PowerPoint would be something we could do. I will tell you though that the more you know about PowerPoint, almost the worse off you are in some cases. So PowerPoint is something you learn. You learn all the bells and whistles, and then you don't use them, because when you use a bunch of animations, you kind of lose your audience. However, that does not mean you shouldn't learn them, because a few well-placed animations or transitions can really add. I will look at that. Access, probably not. I've taught Access for many years. The problem is Access is the least likely program within the Microsoft Office suite that you would run into. And it's not because databases are prevalent in all of what we do. It's that you're going to find the most diversity in programming. Many programs will be very specific to the industry they represent. So even though Access is a good program to learn a lot of this stuff, most industries have a specific proprietary database that they use. Certainly look into it, but PowerPoint would probably come before Access.
Okay, can you show again syntax on referencing a different file?
Sure. And we're going to call it a workbook, because that's what Excel calls files. They're documents in Word, they're workbooks in Excel. So I'm going to bring up that suspense, that filtered suspense. So let me first unfilter that. And by the way, if you want to back out a filter, all you do is you can see that, I don't know if you can see it, I'll make it a little bit bigger. You can see that this is a drop down, but this has a little filter on it. It's really small, I get that, but that means that this is a filtered column. So I just back that out by selecting all, clicking OK, and then I go to this primary sort, and again I select all and OK. Okay, so I have a different workbook here. Don't worry so much about the syntax. Be concerned about how the syntax, how Excel enters the syntax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the other workbook, and this one is an unsaved workbook called Book 1. By the way, you see where maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. It says Book 1:2. That means I have 2 windows open up in Book 1. If I were to close out of this view or close out of this particular view of it, that would disappear. So I really only have 2 workbooks open here. So first step, I hit equal. Once I hit equal, Excel knows that I'm going to either enter a formula or I'm going to click on a cell reference. So all I need to do is go to this cell reference I want. So I'll click on the burning cord here. And I have to click once to make this the active window. And I click again to insert that reference. And again, I know it looks really, really complicated, but all it's saying is equals the name of the workbook, which happens to be suspense. And the reason it has .xlsx is that's the file extension for most Excel workbooks. There's something called a macro-enabled workbook. There's CVS, or comma-separated value files. There's all sorts of different files that Excel can work with, but the most common native format for Excel is .xlsx. So that's why it's there. That's in brackets. And then it's the name of the sheet you're working on, which is down here, sheet 1, and then the name of the cell reference. And based on our conversation before, it introduced a absolute reference. If I don't want that to be an absolute reference, then I would click on it. I'm at a little bit of a risk here. The reason I'm at a risk here is I didn't try this out beforehand, but let me try something. Ah, there we go. It did exactly what I'd hoped it would do. By removing that absolute reference, what it did was I could use the fill handle to continue that reference to a different workbook, and it changed. It put the exact same information and just changed in the direction that I drug it. So below Burning Court was Wet Saturday, and Life of Nellie, and you see that continued that progression. Again, it's right here. It will be in the notes. You'll have the exact syntax. I don't bother with it. I always just use the click method.
Okay. Can you put a chart in the comment box?
No. My answer to that would be no. I've never tried it. I don't think you can. In fact, I'm almost positive you can't because it's a text only, but you know what? Let's try it. Let's go here, and I'm going to go to insert. It's not going to work very well because it's not an actual chart. We'll do this right here. Okay, so here's a chart. I'm going to copy that chart. Now I'm going to right-click on a cell to insert a comment, and I'm going to try to paste that. And the answer that we find is no, cannot do that. This is text only. And by the way, you can make this huge. You can put a lot in here. I mean, you could put a book in here, basically. I wouldn't do that. And the reason is, watch what happens when I hover over this cell. All of a sudden, I'm going to get this huge yellow box that's going to obscure everything I'm trying to look at, and I didn't even click on the cell. So be very careful about your comments. Use them judiciously. Don't use them for everything because they can be kind of annoying, but they can also be awesome because they can give answers to questions that you anticipate. And if I want to delete that comment, I just right-click on the cell in which it occurs. I can either edit the comment or I can delete it.
Okay, when you have data that ends up on a second sheet but you don't need it, how do you delete the page?
If you mean on a printed sheet, or if you want to delete an entire spreadsheet, like if I want to delete a chart here, all I would do is I would right-click on it and I would delete it. Now, you will get a warning message here that says you can't undo deleting sheets. And that's something to be very careful of because your undo button will not work. And then once you do that, it's gone forever. If you mean information that is just on a different printed page, you would just select it and hit delete. Be very careful, though, because Excel works with many off-sheet calculations, meaning that, and we'll get into this in 2 weeks when we talk about the VLOOKUP function, sometimes we'll put an entire table off screen. I can put it, you know, let's say over here, and I'll reference the information off screen in the printable section. So if I say, well, I don't really need anything that's not printed, what I'm going to do is delete everything that is being referenced to be printed. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but Excel works with a lot of information that has no intention of being printed. So you got to be a little bit more careful when you delete things out of an Excel document because it may have a purpose even though you have no purpose in printing it.
Okay, when you enter a formula, do you ever get a series of number signs as an error warning?
Yes. Okay, 2 things to think about. There's a lot of different error warnings. So let me give you a couple of them. One of them is that it just can't fit. So if I have some information here and I enter a formula that says maybe this is there, I'll make it really big numbers. Okay, so I've got numbers here and I'm going to say in this area, I'm going to say this equals this cell times this cell. Now, it did automatically put it, but sometimes it'll do this, where you'll get a whole bunch of pound symbols. That's not necessarily an error code, it can't fit. I don't like how Excel puts things in scientific notation because that means basically nothing to me. I much prefer when it puts it in these pound symbols. And that just means that there's a number that's too large to fit in here. So all I would need to do is increase that size, and then I would get the number itself for the scientific notation. Another error code you get quite often in Excel, and we'll talk about my favorite function of all time, the if function in 2 weeks, that will help you not run into this, is when you do this. So let's say I have this information here, and I say, I'm going to take this and say, I want to take this number divided by this number. And in that case, I'll get a pound symbol and an error code. That error code is division by 0. That's one of the absolute stinkers of Excel. Excel stops in its track when it gets division by 0. It will mess up an entire workbook because this cell could be referenced 20 different places and it doesn't have a number in it anymore. So if a 0 happens to jump into a place where there's a division by it, it'll mess up your entire workbook. There are ways around that, but this particular error code is division by 0. So you got to be careful about that. And if I change this to a 7, all of a sudden it works again because it's a non-zero number. Another very common thing that we get is, as far as error code, what cell am I in? B6. You'll get an error code like this. And it'll say 0, or you might not even get an error. It gave me a little pop-up. What I did there, and different versions of Excel deal with this differently, this is a circular reference. I much prefer an error code to putting 0 in there. The reason is I referenced the cell I was in within the formula. You can't do that because it creates a circular reference. There used to be programming ways you could do that. In basic programming, you could say something like A1 equals A1 plus 1. But in Excel, it's not programming, and that does not work. It'll mess up your worksheet also.
Okay, what's the difference between filtering and sorting?
Sorting is just basically a very quick and easy filter. I do have the filters here. It basically does the same thing. You just have different options when you filter from a list. So, great question. If I wanted to filter a, let's see if I can get back to it. By the way, this particular spreadsheet I've been using for examples for 15 years. It works well for a lot of different things. If I wanted to just take this filter off, and let's go to data, remove that filter, I could select the entire thing and try to do a filter sort. Notice that filter is right within this. I could do a custom sort, and then it's going to allow me a bunch of different options. okay? It's going to bring me through a dialog box. Think of it that this would give you additional options that potentially using a standard filter wouldn't. Play around with them both, see what works best for the situation you're in. Sometimes, though, all you need to do is do a quick filter on a particular column. When you do that, when I do this here, like maybe I want to do by title, I'm going to select the title, and I'm going to say, just do me an A to Z sort. It's going to protect you from yourself. And here's where Word does it badly, Excel does it better, Access does it perfectly. It wants me to expand the selection, because if I just sort based on this, if I just say continue with the current selection, notice Burning Court is Charles Ruggles. If I hit sort, all of a sudden Charles Ruggles is no program. I've lost that cohesion of that data. So instead, I want to quickly undo that. And when I filtered A to Z, I want to expand that selection, which is actually the default option. It will expand everything, and then I will get what I intended it to do. But if you bypass that error warning and actually change something, it will mess it up. And if you save that, you forever lost the cohesion of that data.
Okay, Art, so based on what you're doing here, someone says, I've had issues in sorting. Like in the example, if you chose to sort by the date, it only sorted the date, oldest to newest, and left all the rest of the columns where they were. Do all columns have to be highlighted to keep the information together?
In Excel, yes, and like I just showed you, if I do this by date, which it's already sorted by date, let me do it by episode number real quick here. That I still have to expand it because there's multiple columns here. Okay, so now it's not by date. Well, actually it is, because episode is, let's do it by title. Okay, so now I want to sort it by date. It's the same exact process. I select the row, I sort A to Z, and it's going to ask me, do I want to expand the selection? And it'll expand it across all the rows when I do that, and then it's going to work. What I like to do is I put a marker. Maybe what I do is I take something like this and I highlight it. That way, if I do a sort, I look for that and make sure it's still all in one line. I make sure it's working and doing what I want it to do. So if I were to change this by, like, say, alphabetizing by this and saying expand selection, now I go down a few pages, and I don't think I can do this quickly and easily because I'm on WebEx. I would find that that Charles row would still be yellow all the way across. So I would be guaranteed cohesion of that sort. And it's good to test that because once you lose it, you have to re-enter all the data if you save it.
Art, everybody wants to know the advanced classes.
Oh, that's awesome. I haven't lost everybody yet. By the way, I totally get it. I love Excel. I kind of get geeky on Excel. I hope I didn't lose you with my excitement on here. It'll even get worse with advanced. There's some really cool things we get to show you. That'll happen 2 weeks from today. Next week will be the advanced Microsoft Word class, and we'll go all through like mail merge and some more advanced things in tables and Word. But when we get into the advanced section in Excel, we'll talk about as many functions as we can get through. I'll give you 5 top functions and how to use them. We'll also talk about pivot tables, and we'll talk about using formulas within functions. And it's limitless, really, what you can do with this information. One thing I'm going to leave you with before we wrap up today, this is what excites me. It may not excite you. Knowing that Excel is a real good tool to have within your marketing for your employment, find something that you can use Excel for, whether it's bird watching, whether it's TV shows, whether it's books you've read, whether it's numbers, maybe it's your checking account. If you can use Excel on a daily basis, you will not only maintain your skills, you will obtain new skills on a daily basis that now you can market to an employer. I hope everyone had a good time today. I thank you so much for the great questions. Thank you, Sheila, for filling in with the moderating box. And hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.